Hi, I'm Courtney Gould, and this is my weekly reflection floor. So, after reading the Tower chapter, getting started in the second language, it was interesting to see the development pattern for young children. So, first, there is a period where they use their home language in the second language situation, and then eventually they move on to discover that their home language does not work in this situation, and they tend to enter a nonverbal period. And this is really where they take the time to absorb and understand the new language and will maybe practice sounding it out and experimenting with it. And then children begin to, go public using these practice words, and they'll use like a phrase or a word of the new language. And eventually the children develop a productive use of the second language, and they're able to communicate with phrases and sentences and really communicate with others around them. So we'll get into the home language part. So like the home language, this is where something they already know, so they are very comfortable speaking it, and they'll start by using it, and they'll quickly figure out that no one understands it, and they don't get responses, so they come into what we call the nonverbal period. And, this is where it depends on the student. Some students will stop talking for a very long period of time, and some less than others. It just depends on them. Some will use no words and then isolate themselves, which they call the rejection period. So they isolate themselves from the group, they don't communicate at all, they do things by themselves, and they're not involved at all. Then there's the nonverbal communication. So this is where the students are nonverbal, but they are still communicating by using facial expressions or responding nonverbally when asked questions. So like shaking their head yes or no, or they go and ask for assistance, from the teacher. So if they are unable to do something, they might go and bring the object to the teacher and have the teacher do it for them. So even though they're not speaking, they're finding ways to communicate with us. And this is extremely common in the first few months. They generally use this for attention getting, requesting things, protesting, or joking. So in the attention getting spot, this is typically when they hold something up or show it to you or another person, and they're just looking to get the attention of someone, not really communicate with them. Next is requesting. So this is where they would bring you an object and ask for assistance. Generally, it's an adult in this situation who needs to know what's being asked, since the children is giving minimal detail and not really providing much information. And, depending on if anyone's available really there to help them, they might try and do it on their own, or they could just decide on their own it's too hard, and they just forget about it and move on to the next thing. It just depends. The next thing is protesting. So the child might look upset, maybe whimper, shriek, or push something away, say no. It's their way of saying that they don't want anything to do with it, and they're done with it. Joking. So it says joking can be done by the student getting the attention of someone and giggling from doing something funny, and the person realizes that they're joking around, and then they have a little joke about it. And this is generally, done between a couple students. So next is imitating nonverbal behavior. So those who are English speaking that are exposed to students that aren't English speaking, they will see that the other students are getting attention through their nonverbal communication and might try it themselves. And people normally don't respond to this the way they would for a non-speaking. So the social consequences of of this would, be people don't give them attention, and eventually they end up stopping because they're not getting aware with it. The next thing the chapter talks about is social consequences of nonverbal communication. So some students will treat students that are nonverbal like they're babies. They will talk to them in high-pitched voices. They will use very simple terms like me fix for you or me wipe up for you. Instead of saying, oh, I'll fix it for you or I'll clean it up. They use very dumb terms that, you would use with younger children that don't quite understand, or use a higher pitched voice that you say like, oh, you're so cute. They change their things. There's also another way that they can do this, and that is to completely ignore the person. So generally this happens to a student that's new in the classroom, and they're not really considered to be socially a part of the group, so the students don't acknowledge that they are a part of our group. So that was about it for the chapter that I read. The next thing I did was look at the article First and Second Language Acquisitions, which that was really interesting because it talks about the milestones that you reach when you're doing both your first and your second language acquisition, which is phonology, which is speech sounds that are fundamental components of the language. Then it's lexicon, which is the vocabulary of the person or the language. Then grammar, which is the whole system structure of the language. And then communication, which is exchanging info and communicating with others. I thought this was very interesting because it talks about like the stages. So first, there's a single word stage where they use a single word to express everything. And then there's this 2-word stage where they use 2 words and they start to experiment in putting words together to get things. And then eventually they get to their complex sentences. And then, it talked about all the theories of language development, which I thought was interesting. There were 16 total. I think the one that I enjoyed the most was the social interaction theory. So it basically proposes that children acquire language through close interaction with adults and older children, and that the structure of the language arises out of the social and communication functions of the language. So I think this is really essential, especially in the classroom, because if you sit there and work with them and they communicate with the other students around them, it's going to help their language, versus if they isolate themselves, they're not going to be getting anything out of it. So if you're continuing to really involve them in it and try and communicate with them, it's really going to help them eventually in the long run. And then I also really enjoyed the Context for Learning Part 1 and 2. I thought this was something great you could implement in the classroom because, maybe you could do it when the child first gets there, go through all the questions that were asked, use the chart, and then reassess in the middle of the year and maybe at the end of the year to see how much they're progressing, which I think could be really helpful because it could show you maybe where they're excelling and where they're not doing so well, so you could work more in that area. Overall, that's what I got from this week, and thanks for listening.